in the yard, and I pulled out my phone, looked at her app, and I saw all the information I wanted about that lovely house. That's one of the things you get with Kathy Helbig and the Kathy Helbig Group. Good morning, Kathy Helbig.
Morning, guys.
Okay, so lots of people talk about you're going to pay the closing costs. No, you're going to pay the closing costs. No, I'll pay the closing costs.
Right.
What are closing costs?
Exactly. A lot of people, especially first-time buyers, have no idea what to expect on what's called closing costs. The real term is called settlement charges because it comes from a couple of different areas. So when we're talking about anything that can be included in a closing cost, because sometimes you can take the total of closing costs and add it to the price of the house that you're buying, and then have the seller credit you that amount back so you don't actually have to come to the table with that money in hand. So that's really handy for people that are maybe a little short on cash or want to roll some of those charges in at closing and then just have a bigger nut to borrow.
Right.
But some of those closings consist of, there's lender charges, there's title company charges, and then there's also something called prepaid. So when you do write something into a contract saying that you want somebody to pay your closing costs, you want to include the word prepaid and or points as well. That way, because you don't exactly know what your settlement charges are going to be up front when you're writing that contract. So this way it gives you a little bit of a cushion that you can include things such as your building inspection, the appraisal, the title insurance, your hazard insurance. A lot of times you have to, not a lot of times, every time, you have to come to the table with 1 year's prepaid homeowners insurance. You also have to set up your escrow accounts. Those escrow accounts are 3 months of cushion for your property taxes and your homeowner's insurance. So those are called prepaids. So we can wrap all that into what people call closing cost, and then have you come to the table with less money. There's also the lender fees. So whatever the lender's charging to originate that loan, the credit report, like I said, the appraisal, all of that stuff can be called a closing cost.
Okay, so when who typically, and I know there's nothing typical when it comes to real estate,
right,
but is there a rule of thumb? The buyer usually pays closing costs, or the buyer pays their closing costs and the seller pays their closing costs?
Right, correct. In Missouri, the buyers pay the buyer's closing cost, which are, title charges, flood certs, things like that,
right,
appraisals. And then the seller has their own closing costs that they have to pay, which is going to be their property taxes that are prorated up until the day of closing. So you close on July 20th, you've got to factor in that you're going to come to the table closing day paying January 1 to July 20th's taxes. That's going to be a credit to the buyer that day because the buyer's going to get that tax bill at the end of the year. So all that's kind of figured into escrow accounts and stuff too.
Gotcha.
But that does come out of your proceeds.
Gotcha.
So those closing costs, title company costs for the seller. In other states, sellers don't have to pay the closing costs. So it's Missouri's a little bit different.
So when they say, hey, you're going to pay, when you negotiate and the seller says, all right, I'll pay your closing costs. Mm-hmm. The seller's paying all of those costs, those flood insurance and homeowners insurance and all that type of stuff?
Sort of. It's up to what is allowed. So depending on what type of loan that they are getting, there's a certain amount of closing costs that are allowed to be kind of wrapped into all of that.
Is it like a certain percentage or just,
it
varies? Yeah,
it varies. And the loans all vary. So sometimes you have to write in an amount that you're guesstimating. And then, what we're trying to do is make sure there's not money left on the table there if the closing costs aren't all used up and you negotiated $5,000 into the price, but you only use $4,000 in closing costs. That's why it's important for the agent and the lender to be communicating with each other so that we can kind of generally figure out where that number is.
And the buyer can finance all those closing costs.
The buyer can finance most of the closing costs. There's certain things that are allowed and there's certain things that aren't allowed, but the majority of them, yes, can be rolled into the price, and then you are taking a higher loan balance out for the closing costs that you're putting into the price of the house.
Sounds like you do that, or you just call Kathy
You
Helbig.
call Kathy.
Absolutely.
All right, KathyHelbigGroup.com. Not just Kathy Helbig, you get her full team. A friend of mine used your service. They said it was fantastic. It
Yes.
was the white glove service, if you will.
Absolutely.
Everything was taken
Glad
care
she
of.
was happy.
And don't forget the app. The app is a great way to sort of kick the tires and look at all of the information on all the houses, the for sale by owner, the houses that are on the market, all of that with the great app, KathyHelbigGroup.com. Thanks for checking in.
Thanks, guys.
You got it. 740 here, Big 550, KTRS.
The Big 5.